Do you think everything can be bought with money? Well, today, I'm going to show you where that belief can take you, right to the edge of everything you thought was true. Welcome, everyone! Get ready for a story full of surprises, deep emotions, and shocking revelations. If you've ever wondered whether chasing after the perfect life really leads to happiness, then this is the story for you. But here's the real question. What would you do if you discovered that everything you thought you wanted wasn't actually what you needed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Rachel made the right choice, or did she let her ambitions blind her to what truly matters? I'd love to hear your thoughts on her journey and what you would do if you were Rachel. The sky hung heavy over the city as Ethan sat in the driver's seat of his car, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. He had been planning this evening for weeks, carefully curating every detail. Tonight was the night he was going to introduce Rachel to his father. The dinner at Le Pouc, a lavish French restaurant known for its extravagant decor and high-end clientele, was supposed to be a symbol of something he was going to believe in. A future with Rachel. A future where she would see beyond the surface and accept him for who he truly was. Rachel had been bubbling with excitement ever since he invited her. She had no idea what was coming, and part of Ethan couldn't wait to see her reaction. Would she fall for the charm of the restaurant? Would she find some respect for his father George, even though his job wasn't the kind that glittered in the world of luxury? Ethan wasn't sure, but he had hoped, for just one evening, Rachel would understand the value of sincerity over wealth. Rachel's excitement had been contagious in the days leading up to the dinner. She had been so eager to tell Hannah, her best friend, that she had scored an invite to meet the mysterious Ethan's father. She assumed Ethan's family was as rich as he looked, clean-cut, successful, the kind of man who must surely come from money. Rachel wasn't exactly shy about her dreams of a life filled with wealth, and she had already pictured herself comfortably nestled in a life of privilege, surrounded by plush furniture and expensive dinners. "Oh, you're gonna love this," Rachel said, chatting animatedly to Hannah on the phone just before the dinner. "I bet Ethan's dad is going to be just like him. Rich, successful, and so out of my league. I can't wait to impress them." Hannah, always keen to be part of Rachel's fantasies, insisted on joining them, claiming she wanted to witness the whole wealthy lifestyle firsthand. Ethan, slightly taken aback but willing to keep the peace, agreed. He figured the more the merrier, but deep down he wondered if it was a mistake to include Hannah. After all, it wasn't just about impressing Rachel, it was about showing her the man he really was. As they arrived at Le Pouc, the towering walls of the restaurant loomed like a grand palace. Gold-plated accents gleamed under the soft ambient lighting. The scent of delicate French cuisine filled the air, mingling with the quiet hum of hushed conversations and clinking glasses. Everything about the space screamed sophistication, from the gleaming chandeliers to the polished marble floors. It was a setting Rachel had imagined herself in countless times, a place where she could feel like she belonged. Ethan pulled open the door, offering Rachel the bouquet of roses he had picked out specifically for the occasion. Rachel's eyes sparkled, and she sighed as she took them from him, pressing them against her chest. "Oh, Ethan, this is just perfect. Your dad is going to love me," she said, voice dripping with the anticipation of wealth and grandeur. Ethan smiled faintly, leading her through the opulent space. "I'm sure he will." Don't forget to like if you find this story meaningful to you and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. As they approached their table, Rachel looked around, noting the extravagant decor. Her gaze shifted around, clearly expecting to see someone important, someone rich. "So, when is your dad going to join us?" she asked eagerly. Ethan, sensing her expectations, hesitated for a moment before answering. He pointed to a man standing by the corner in a janitor's uniform, sweeping the floor with practiced precision. "That's him," Ethan said softly, his heart tightening as he watched Rachel's eyes flicker with disbelief. Rachel's expression shifted rapidly from excitement to confusion, then to something darker. She blinked, her lips tightening as she processed the image in front of her. A janitor. Not a wealthy businessman, not the kind of man she'd imagined. Ethan's father, his real father, was the very person who had been scrubbing the floors of this lavish restaurant. Rachel's breath hitched in her chest, and she felt the sting of humiliation. How could Ethan deceive her like this? She had been so sure that he came from wealth, from a family that could offer her everything she dreamed of. But now, standing there in the middle of this restaurant, she felt foolish, exposed. "I thought," she started, her voice trembling with frustration, "I thought you said your family was rich. You've been lying to me, haven't you?" Ethan stood there for a moment, stunned by the change in her tone. He opened his mouth to explain, but Rachel wasn't listening. She was already stepping forward, her voice growing louder. "This is humiliating, Ethan," she spat, her words like daggers. "You're just a liar, pretending to be something you're not." Ethan's face hardened, the warmth in his eyes replaced by a cold, quiet resolve. "This is my father," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I'm proud of him. Wealth isn't everything." But Rachel wasn't listening. She picked up the bouquet of roses he had given her and, in a flurry of indignation, tossed them onto the floor. Crushing them beneath her heel, she sneered. "I can't believe I wasted my time with you. I thought I was going to marry into money. You're just a poor liar." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as Rachel turned on her heel, her face contorted with anger and disgust. Before he could say anything more, she was storming out of the restaurant, dragging Hannah behind her. The door slammed shut, leaving Ethan standing there, his heart sinking. George, Ethan's father, stepped forward, his face unchanged by the scene that had just unfolded. He reached out a hand, offering a calm, quiet greeting. "I'm George," he said softly, his voice kind but steady. Rachel sneered, refusing to shake his hand. "I don't want anything to do with you," she snapped, her eyes flaring with contempt. George simply nodded, unbothered by her hostility. "I understand," he said, turning back to Ethan, who stood there, frozen in place. Ethan stood tall, his voice low but unwavering. "You don't get to insult him," he said, stepping between Rachel and his father. "He's a good man, and you're not welcome here anymore." The confrontation left Rachel seething, her anger bubbling over. She didn't care about Ethan's excuses. She only cared about her image, her plans for a life of luxury. "I'm done," she said coldly, her voice cutting through the tense air. "I'm better than this." As she stormed out, Ethan was left standing at the threshold, heartbroken but resolute. He had never been prouder of his father. As they settled into their seats, the dimly lit ambiance of Les Alpouques enveloped them, the gleam of crystal chandeliers casting soft, golden glows across the table. Rachel was still holding the bouquet of roses tightly in her hands, the petals soft and velvety. She couldn't help but marvel at the restaurant's opulence, her fingers tracing the delicate stems of the flowers as though they might magically bring her closer to the life she had imagined for herself. A life of privilege, one where wealth wasn't just a dream but a reality. She imagined herself here regularly, rubbing elbows with society's elite. This was the kind of life she had envisioned with Ethan, one of luxury and status. Ethan noticed her gaze wandering across the room, her eyes wide with awe. He smiled to himself, a tinge of pride swelling within him. For a moment, he was hopeful. Maybe this would be the moment Rachel would see things differently, would see beyond appearances, beyond the wealth she thought mattered. But As he watched her, a small part of him felt a twinge of doubt. This wasn't just a dinner. This was the first step in showing her his world, a world that wasn't defined by the things she valued. He wanted her to understand that. But tonight, he wasn't sure if he had made the right choice. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks and smiled, trying to keep things light. "You look stunning tonight," he said, his voice warm but slightly strained, hoping to put her at ease. Rachel's smile was barely more than a flicker of light, but she nodded, acknowledging his compliment without fully returning it. "Thank you," she said, her voice distant, her mind already somewhere else. She glanced at the menu in front of her, but her attention was split, her thoughts swirling. Where is he? She thought, scanning the restaurant for Ethan's father. Any idea when your dad will be here? She asked, a slight edge to her tone as she caught Ethan's eye. Ethan's gaze softened, his hand resting gently on the edge of the table. He's just finishing up a few things. He'll be here soon. Rachel's lips parted in confusion, but she nodded, offering a brief smile, trying to remain composed. Ethan didn't notice the slight tension in her jaw as she glanced around again. A few moments later, a man in a janitor's uniform passed by their table, pushing a broom across the floor, his movements slow and deliberate. The soft clink of his shoes against the marble floors resonated in the quiet of the room. Rachel's eyes followed him, and her gaze hardened when she saw Ethan nod toward him. "That's him," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. Rachel's gaze snapped back to Ethan, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. She blinked once, then twice, as though processing the reality of the moment. Her mind raced. This can't be happening. This isn't what I thought. The bouquet of roses suddenly felt too heavy in her hands, the softness of the petals becoming a sharp contrast to the sudden coldness creeping into her chest. "Wow," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan's voice was calm but resolute. "That's my dad, George." The words didn't sink in at first. Rachel's eyes flickered from the man in the janitor's uniform to Ethan, searching for any sign of jest, but there was none. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a mistake. Ethan had just pointed to the man who had been sweeping the floor. A hard, dry laugh escaped Rachel's throat as she pushed herself back from the table, her chair scraping across the marble floor in protest. The sound of it filled the space between them like a gaping chasm. "This is a joke, right?" she said, her voice rising, laced with frustration. "I thought you said your family was wealthy. You brought me here to meet a janitor?" Ethan felt the sting of her words, but didn't let it show on his face. His hand clenched around the edge of the table. "Rachel, I told you this was important to me, but I also told you my family is more than what you see on the surface." But as Rachel wasn't listening, her face reddened as her frustration boiled over, her fingers tightening around the bouquet of roses until the stems snapped and the flowers fell to the ground, their petals scattering like shattered dreams. "You lied to me," she yelled, her voice growing louder. "This is humiliating, Ethan. You've been deceiving me from the start." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the words cutting through him like a knife. He opened his mouth to respond, but Rachel was already moving toward the man in the janitor's uniform, pointing a finger at him, her voice dripping with disgust. "You think I'm going to sit here with him?" she spat. "A filthy janitor? As soon as I finished frying my dinner, I am going home to settle in with my virgin mother and fill my head with wonder." Ethan stood up abruptly, his chair clattering to the floor behind him. "Rachel, that's enough," he said, his voice low but firm, filled with both pain and a quiet determination. "You don't get to speak to him like that. He's my father and he deserves your respect." Rachel's face contorted with disbelief, her eyes wide with anger. "Respect? For a janitor? You've got to be kidding me. I thought I was meeting a businessman, someone with power, someone who could give me the life I deserve. But you're nothing like what you promised me. You're just like him." She didn't wait for a response, turning on her heel and storming toward the exit. Ethan's heart sank. The words felt like they were tearing him apart from the inside out. His father was just as worthy of respect as anyone else, regardless of his job. But Rachel couldn't see that. She couldn't understand the value of a man who worked hard for what he had. George stood off to the side, calm and composed. He watched the scene unfold without flinching, as though he had seen this before. His eyes never wavered from Rachel's retreating form, the hint of a sigh escaping him. "Let her go, Ethan," George said, his voice soft and steady. "You know her better than anyone, but if she can't see who you really are, then maybe she's not the one for you." Ethan's eyes burned with unshed tears as he looked at his father, the weight of the moment settling over him. George's simple, quiet wisdom cut through the chaos of his emotions, offering him a sense of calm in the middle of the storm. Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse. He turned toward the door, pausing just before he followed Rachel. "But I need to know, for myself." As Ethan moved to catch up to Rachel, George remained behind, his expression unchanged, resolute. Ethan felt the sting of Rachel's rejection deep in his chest, but one thing was clear. He could never choose someone who couldn't accept his father, the man who had given him everything. The night air outside Leolpook was thick with tension, the warm glow from the restaurant's windows casting long shadows onto the pavement as Ethan hurried after Rachel. His footsteps echoed in the quiet street, each one feeling heavier than the last. He had never imagined this moment would unfold like this, not in his wildest dreams. Rachel, the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had hoped to build a future with, had just torn that future to pieces. His chest tightened with every step, his heart aching in a way he hadn't expected. Rachel stormed ahead, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, a rhythm that seemed to mock him with each step. She didn't look back, her back rigid, her posture stiff with indignation. Ethan wanted to call out to her, to explain, to tell her that she had misunderstood, that his father's worth wasn't measured by the job he did. But how could he reach someone so consumed by her own expectations? Someone who couldn't see beyond the glint of gold and the shine of high society? How could he explain to Rachel that his father had been everything to him, even if he didn't wear a suit or sit in a boardroom? "Rachel, wait!" Ethan called, his voice breaking through the quiet night. His words hung in the air like a plea, a desperate cry for understanding. "Just stop. We need to talk about this." She whirled around, her face contorted with anger, her eyes blazing. "Talk? There's nothing to talk about, Ethan," she snapped, her voice dripping with scorn. "You lied to me. You led me to believe that your family was someone important, and now I see what you really are." Her words cut deep, like shards of glass, leaving him wounded in a way he hadn't anticipated. She didn't even know how much they hurt. Ethan's face flushed, a mixture of shame and frustration rising within him. How could she not see? How could she not understand? "I never lied to you, Rachel. I told you from the beginning that my family wasn't about wealth. We may not have millions, but we have something that's worth more. Respect, hard work, integrity." His voice trembled, a slight crack betraying the pain he felt. "You think everything is about money, but that's not life. That's not love." Rachel's lips curled into a sneer. "Respect? Hard work? You expect me to respect him?" She jerked her thumb back towards the restaurant, toward the man she could only see as less than her. "He's just a janitor, a man who cleans up after the rich. That's not respect, Ethan. That's pathetic." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, the sting of her words like a slap across his face. Pathetic. The word echoed in his mind, each syllable sharpening the pain he was feeling. He had always known his father wasn't wealthy in the traditional sense, but he was everything to Ethan. Everything. And now, Rachel was spitting on the one thing that mattered most to him. "That's enough," Ethan shouted, his voice suddenly louder than before, a force rising within him. "You don't get to talk about my father like that. You don't get to tear him down because he's not dressed in the suit or driving some fancy car. He's a man who built me into who I am today. He gave me a roof over my head, food on my table, and love in my heart. And you know what, Rachel?" He took a step forward, his breath shallow with the intensity of his words. "You have no idea what that means." Rachel's face twisted into a mask of disbelief. She stepped back as if his words physically repelled her, and her voice dripped with disdain. "Love? Are you seriously still talking about love?" She scoffed, the sound like a sharp slap to his face. "I don't care about your love, Ethan. I care about success. I care about status, about a future that's worth something." Her eyes glittered with a cold, calculating intensity. "And I won't be stuck with a man who thinks being poor is somehow noble. That's not the life I want." The words burned, each one sinking into Ethan's chest like a fresh wound. He had been so certain of her, so certain that Rachel was the one who understood him, who could see past all of this, the wealth, the glamour, the luxury. He had hoped she would love him for who he was, not for what he could give her. But in that moment, he saw the truth. The cruel, ugly truth. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice soft but firm, the pain in his eyes now matching the strength in his words. "You never cared about me. You cared about what you could get from me, and that's the truth." He paused, his gaze hardening as the finality of it all settled in. "I deserve more than this, Rachel. More than this game of appearances you're playing." Rachel's face flushed with humiliation, her anger morphing into something darker, more desperate. "You think you deserve more?" she spat, her words biting and sharp. "You'll never have more than this. You'll never be anything more than what you are right now, a failure." Before Ethan could say another word, she turned on her heel and stormed off, leaving him standing in the middle of the empty street, the weight of her rejection crashing over him. He wanted to chase her, to beg her to see the truth, but something inside him told him that it was too late. She had already made her choice. As he stood there, his heart heavy with disbelief, a calm voice broke through the chaos of his thoughts. "Let her go, son," George said, his voice steady and unwavering. He had been watching the entire scene unfold from the sidelines, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "If she can't see who you are, who we are, then she's not worth your time." His words were simple, but they held a power that Ethan couldn't ignore. His father was always calm, always steady, a rock in the storm of his emotions. George stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You don't need to prove anything to her, son. Not anymore." Ethan swallowed hard, the tears threatening to spill, but he held them back. His father's words were like a balm to his wounded heart. "I know, Dad. I know. But it hurts." George nodded, his expression softening. I know it does. But remember this. It's not the wealth that defines you. It's the kind of man you are. And you're a good man, Ethan. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Ethan looked up at his father, the strength of his presence grounding him. He realized in that moment that he didn't need Rachel. He needed his father, his family, people who loved him for who he truly was, not for the things he could offer. And that realization, painful as it was, gave him the clarity he needed to walk away from the toxic relationship and towards something far more valuable. The cool night air rushed around Ethan as he stood just outside the restaurant's grand doors, the sharp contrast between the warmth of the dining room and the chill of the street pulling at him. His mind raced, heart still pounding in his chest as the echoes of Rachel's words reverberated in his head. Failure. Pathetic. His fists clenched, his fists gritted. The pain was raw, sharp, almost unbearable. How could she have said those things to him? How could she have dismissed everything he'd worked for, everything his father had sacrificed? He looked back at the restaurant, the glowing lights spilling onto the sidewalk as if mocking him. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the high society elegance, it all felt like a distant memory now. What had he hoped for? A happy evening? An easy introduction to the woman he had wanted to build a life with? Instead, it had all shattered before his eyes. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling inside him. Why did he feel so empty? Why couldn't he shake off the feeling that he had lost more than just a woman tonight? That maybe, just maybe, he had lost a part of himself in trying to please someone who could never see past the surface. As he took a step forward, his gaze caught the familiar form of his father standing in the shadow of the restaurant, waiting patiently. George was calm, as always, his back straight, his hands folded behind him as though he had been expecting this moment. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there in the quiet, his presence a quiet reassurance that Ethan had never truly been alone. Ethan walked toward him, the weight of his emotions pulling at his shoulders. The sidewalk felt longer than it should, as though each step forward was a step further away from everything he had believed in, everything he had hoped for. He wanted to feel angry, to lash out, to scream at the unfairness of it all, but instead all he could feel was a strange heaviness in his chest. "I tried, Dad," Ethan said, his voice tight, barely a whisper. I really thought she was the one, but I guess I was wrong." George remained silent for a moment, his eyes soft but firm. He didn't rush to offer comfort, didn't attempt to fix the situation with empty words. He simply looked at his son, his gaze unwavering, full of understanding. "You didn't do anything wrong, Ethan," George replied, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside Ethan's chest. "You were honest with her. You showed her who you are. If that wasn't enough for her, then it's not your fault." Ethan's shoulders slumped as the weight of his father's words sank in. He didn't know how to feel. Part of him felt relief, like a heavy burden had been lifted from his chest, but the other part was drowning in sorrow. He had wanted so badly for Rachel to be the one to understand him, to accept him, and yet she hadn't. Her words still stung, lingering in his mind, mocking him, making him question his worth. Pathetic. A failure. The disappointment was a dull ache in his chest, one that wasn't going to fade easily. But there was something else too. As the initial shock of the confrontation wore off, Ethan found a strange clarity slowly starting to form in his mind. For the first time, he realized he wasn't defined by someone else's perception of him. He wasn't defined by Rachel's view of success or her idea of what mattered. He was defined by what he believed in, by the people who had stood by him, by his family, and by the quiet strength his father had always embodied. George reached out, placing a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder, the weight of it grounding him, steadying him in the face of his emotions. "You don't need her, Ethan. You deserve someone who values you for who you are, not for what you can give them. And don't let her or anyone else make you feel otherwise." Ethan nodded, a lump forming in his throat as he fought to hold back the tears that threatened to break free. He had never been good at letting go, never been the type to walk away from something he wanted. But tonight, In the space between his father's steady calm and his own emotional chaos, he knew what he had to do. "I know, Dad, I'm just tired of feeling like I'm not enough," Ethan confessed, the weight of his words heavier than anything he'd said before. "But maybe it's time to stop trying to prove something to someone who doesn't see me for who I really am." The air seemed to still around them, the noise from the restaurant fading into the background. It was as if the world had paused, giving Ethan a moment to breathe, to think, to finally understand. His hands relaxed at his sides, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He wasn't sure where he went from here, but at least he knew he was starting to walk away from something that had never been right for him. George smiled, a small but meaningful gesture. "That's my boy," he said softly. "You're stronger than you realize." Ethan let out a shaky laugh, feeling a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't the answer he had hoped for, but it was the one he needed. There would be no more chasing after someone who couldn't appreciate him, no more pretending to be someone he wasn't. Tonight had been painful, but in the quiet aftermath, there was a strange sort of peace. As the two of them stood there in the cool night air, the street lights casting long shadows on the pavement, Ethan felt the beginnings of a new resolve forming inside him. He didn't need Rachel's approval. He didn't need her validation. What he needed was to honor himself, and that meant letting go of the relationship that had never been built on respect or love. The awful seed taking matters into your own hands. I think we go to find the truth, or maybe someone will tell it to us. George gave a nod, his approval a silent acknowledgement of the strength Ethan had just begun to realize he had all along. Together, they turned away from the restaurant, from the past that had clung to Ethan's every step. They walked into the night, leaving behind the toxic shadows of what could have been, and heading towards something better, a future that belonged to Ethan alone, one where he could be free to be himself. The next few days passed in a haze for Ethan. Each morning he awoke with the weight of the confrontation still heavy on his chest, as if his heart had been cracked open and the pieces scattered in the chaos of the night. Rachel's words echoed in his mind, haunting him like a distant scream. "You think you deserve more? Pathetic." He kept replaying the moments at Lael Pook. Her anger, her contempt, the way she had torn apart everything he held dear with nothing more than her words. It hurt more than he cared to admit, more than he could put into words. He had never imagined that the woman he had hoped would be his partner in life would be capable of such cruelty. In the quiet solitude of his apartment, Ethan tried to move past the hurt, but it wasn't easy. His thoughts often turned to his father, George, who had been unwavering through it all, the steady rock in the storm. In George's eyes, Ethan saw no judgment, only pride. It was a comfort, but also a reminder of how far Rachel had missed the point. She had never seen the value in love without gold, in effort without material reward. Ethan realized, with painful clarity, that their relationship had been built on lies, a false hope, a facade held together by Rachel's desire for wealth, and now it was all unraveling. Rachel, on the other hand, had been a whirlwind of emotions after the fallout. She had tried to convince herself that Ethan's rejection was just a momentary lapse, a misstep that could be fixed with the right words and gestures. But every time she reached for her phone to call him, to apologize, to explain, something held her back. There was a gnawing emptiness inside her that she couldn't ignore. For the first time, she found herself staring into the mirror, seeing her reflection not as a woman of strength, but as a woman who had allowed herself to be swallowed by ambition. She had made a fool of herself. The first time she saw Ethan after the dinner, Her heart twisted with a mixture of regret and anger. She had hoped to find him softened by time, ready to forgive her and return to their old dynamic. But when she walked into his apartment, there was none of the warmth she remembered. Only silence. His eyes met hers, but they no longer held the softness she had been accustomed to. Instead, there was a hardness to him now, a new resolve. "Please," she said, her voice trembling as she stepped forward. "I didn't mean it. I was angry. I was embarrassed. She stopped herself, shaking her head. Words felt inadequate now, as if they had no power to fix what had been broken. Ethan didn't move. His expression remained calm, but there was a weight behind his eyes that told her everything she needed to know. "You think you can just apologize and everything will go back to how it was?" he asked, his voice low, almost too calm for comfort. "Rachel, this isn't about what happened that night. It's about you really care about. And I'm not it. I was never going to be enough for you, not the way you want. You were never interested in me. You were only interested in what I could offer you." Her face flushed with embarrassment. Her eyes flickered to the floor, unable to meet his gaze. The truth, brutal, sharp, and undeniable, was sinking in. "I wanted him for the wrong reasons. I wanted his wealth, his status, his life, not him." Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? What could possibly make up for the way she had treated him, for the way she had allowed herself to be blinded by materialism? "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling small and empty, like a confession to a priest that could never erase the sins committed. "I was wrong. I didn't mean to hurt you." But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. His heart had already begun to heal, slowly and painfully, from the wounds she had inflicted. It was as though a door had closed inside him, and he could no longer go back to the way things were. He had been forced to confront a painful reality, one where Rachel's love was not built on who he was, but on what he could provide. He had thought she was the one who could look past the surface, who would see him for who he truly was. But in the end, she had shown him exactly who she was, and the person he had loved had never really existed. "You were always looking for something more," he said, his voice now steady with the certainty of his decision. "And I don't know when I stopped being enough for you. But I'm done, Rachel. I can't keep pretending that this—" He gestured between them, his hand sweeping the distance that had grown between them both emotionally and physically. "I can't keep pretending that this is love. It's not." Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat. She had no more excuses, no more lies to tell. The emptiness inside her grew, filling the space where the desire for wealth and status once lived. And as she stood there, helpless, her reality crumbling, she realized how far she had fallen, how much she had lost in chasing after the wrong things. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, but this time there was no longer hope in her voice, only a deep, aching regret. She knew, deep down, that it was too late. Ethan had already made his decision. He was done, and nothing she could say or do would ever change that. Ethan nodded once, his eyes meeting hers for the last time. "Goodbye, Rachel." He turned and walked away without another word, his steps echoing in the silence that filled the room. As he walked out of the apartment, a strange sense of relief washed over him, a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in days, he could breathe again, unburdened by the false promises and materialistic dreams that had clouded his judgment. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be heartbreak, there would be moments of doubt, but in that moment, he felt certain of one thing. He deserved more than the love Rachel had offered him. He deserved a love that wasn't based on wealth, on appearances, or on empty gestures. As the door closed behind him, Rachel stood alone in the empty apartment, the silence surrounding her like a thick fog. She had lost more than Ethan. She had lost herself, and the person she had become was someone she could no longer recognize. Days passed, but the sting of Ethan's rejection stayed fresh, like a wound that refused to heal. Rachel tried to move on, tried to find someone who could fill the void that Ethan had left behind, but there was a gnawing emptiness in her chest that nothing could satisfy. She had thought she could get over him quickly, thought she could move on to the next shiny object, just as she always had in the past. But something had shifted inside her. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life was spiraling, that she had lost something more valuable than she had ever realized. It wasn't long before she met Miguel. He was different, charming, handsome, with the kind of polished confidence that seemed to match the world she thought she deserved. He told her he was an investor, a man of means, someone who could give her everything she wanted. His eyes sparkled with the promise of wealth, and for the first time since the dinner with Ethan, Rachel allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. "I can take you places you've never been," Miguel promised, his voice smooth like velvet, as he flashed her a smile that made her stomach flip. "Come with me. I know just the place for us to dine." Miguel led her to Lau Puk again, the same restaurant where everything had fallen apart with Ethan. This time, Rachel felt a strange sense of vindication. She would walk in, flaunt her new companion, and show Ethan just how easily she could replace him. She was going to prove to herself that her desires weren't wrong, that her pursuit of wealth and status was justified. This time, she wasn't the one left standing outside. She was the one who belonged. As they entered the restaurant, Rachel couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. The chandeliers still gleamed, the aroma of fine French cuisine filling the air, the laughter of the patrons mingling with the clink of silverware. This was her world. She had finally found her place. The matron d' greeted them warmly, leading them to a table in the center of the room. The familiar feeling of luxury washed over Rachel, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that everything she had dreamed of was finally coming true. But then, as she settled into her seat, something caught her eye. A familiar face. She squinted, trying to make sense of it, her eyes widening as recognition clicked in. At a table across the room, sitting with a glass of wine, was none other than Ethan's father, George. For a moment, Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. What was George doing here? She quickly looked around the room, scanning for any sign of Ethan, but he wasn't there. Instead, her eyes landed on a woman sitting next to George, a woman she didn't recognize, but who was laughing softly as George spoke. Her confusion deepened when she overheard a conversation between two waitstaff. "The owner is here tonight," one said quietly to the other. "He's just waiting for his guest to arrive." Rachel's mind raced. Owner? She had never heard that George was the owner of Lau Puk. In fact, she had assumed he was just another employee, one of the countless workers who kept the place running smoothly. But if George was the owner, then who was Miguel, really? Miguel, noticing her moment of hesitation, leaned in close, his voice low and smooth. "Something wrong?" he asked, a knowing smile playing at his lips. Rachel forced a smile back, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "No, just surprised," she said, her voice laced with tension. She quickly turned her attention back to George, her mind reeling. There had to be some mistake. If George was the owner, why had he kept that from her? Why had he let her believe he was just a janitor? Just then, as if on cue, George stood up from his table, nodding to the woman beside him, and made his way to the bar. Rachel watched him, heart pounding in her chest. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but she wasn't ready for the full picture yet. Miguel caught her gaze, and his smile grew wider. "Don't tell me you didn't know," he said, his voice almost teasing now. "George is the one who owns this place. He's the reason this restaurant is so successful. But I'm sure you've figured that out by now." Rachel's stomach twisted into a knot, her thoughts spiraling. How had she missed this? She had been so caught up in the facade of wealth, so eager to find someone who could give her the life she thought she deserved, that she had overlooked the most important detail of all. The man she had so eagerly cast aside was the one who had been at the heart of everything she had wanted. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and she felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. She had treated George with such contempt, assuming he was beneath her, assuming his worth was defined by the job he did. She had judged him, and she had judged Ethan, without ever truly understanding what they were about. She had been so blinded by her own desire for riches that she had failed to see the truth staring her in the face. Just then, a voice interrupted her thoughts.
"Excuse me, Miss Rachel?"
It was Emily, Ethan's sister, walking toward her with a polite smile. "I couldn't help but notice you're here again. I see you've met Miguel, but—" Emily paused, glancing over Rachel's shoulder at Miguel, then at her, with a faint smile. "You probably didn't know that Miguel isn't the owner here. He's just the manager. My father, George, he's the one who owns this place, has for years." Rachel's heart skipped a beat, the truth crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Her face turned pale as she realized the extent of her mistake. Ethan's father, the man she had mocked, the man she had scorned, was the one who had built this empire. Everything she had thought was true about him had been wrong. Everything she had thought she knew about wealth, success, and love had been built on lies. And then, as if the universe was playing a cruel trick on her, Ethan walked into the restaurant, dressed in a sharp, well-tailored suit, his presence undeniable. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Rachel saw the confidence in him that she had never noticed before. It wasn't just the suit, it was the way he carried himself, the way he stood tall, the way he owned the space around him. He walked over to her, his gaze unwavering. "I thought you should know," he said quietly, his voice firm but calm. "You were right about one thing. I'm not like the man you thought I was. I'm much more than that." He glanced at Miguel, then back at Rachel, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry you couldn't see that sooner." Miguel, who had been smug and assured only moments before, faltered under Ethan's gaze. The contrast was sharp, the polished image of Miguel crumbling in the face of Ethan's quiet strength. Rachel opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing she could say, nothing that could undo the damage she had done, nothing that could fix the hole she had created in her life by chasing after the wrong things. And just like that, the truth had been laid bare. Rachel's pursuit of wealth had led her to the most humiliating of realizations. She had misjudged everything. Ethan had been the one to walk away from her, but now she understood. He was the one who had always been worthy. The days following the revelation were a blur for Rachel. Everything she had built in her mind about success, about love, crumbled beneath the weight of one truth: I was wrong. The realization hung over her like a heavy fog, a suffocating cloud she couldn't escape. The truth about George, about Ethan, about herself. It was too much to bear. She had spent so much time chasing after what she thought would fulfill her, only to find herself empty, alone in a world of false promises. It wasn't just the humiliation of seeing Ethan in that sharp suit, standing tall and self-assured, or the shock of learning that George was the true architect behind the restaurant's success. It was the crushing weight of knowing that she had discarded everything real in her life, everything valuable, just for the chance at a gilded cage. She had underestimated Ethan, mistaking his quiet strength for weakness. She had assumed that material wealth was the only thing that mattered, but as she stood in the same restaurant, now painfully aware of how wrong she had been, it became clear to her that she had sacrificed something much greater than any diamond or penthouse could offer. Rachel's phone rang incessantly, a constant reminder of the life she had tried to build. Contacts, friends, business opportunities, all aimed at the goal of wealth. But none of them felt real now. As the days passed, her attempts to reconnect with Ethan were met with cold silence. The doors she had once confidently walked through now seemed closed, locked tight by the man who had shown her true worth. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. She had no one to blame but herself. She had sabotaged everything, torn apart a future that could have been, all because she had been too blinded by ambition to see the man standing right in front of her. Ethan, on the other hand, had found a strange peace in the days that followed. It wasn't an easy peace, not at all. His heart still ached from the betrayal, from the harsh words Rachel had thrown at him. But with each passing moment, he felt lighter, as if the weight of her expectations and the pain of her rejection had been lifted from his shoulders. He had spent so many years of his life measuring his worth through other people's eyes, letting their expectations shape his every decision. He had wanted to please Rachel, to be the man she wanted him to be, but now, in the silence of his own thoughts, he understood that he had been running after something that had never truly been his to begin with. The illusion of love that Rachel had promised had never been about him. It had always been about what he could provide, about his ability to give her the life she thought she deserved. With time, Ethan found solace in the simple truths. He no longer needed validation from someone who could not see beyond material wealth. He had spent years trying to prove himself to the wrong person, but now he knew the most important thing of all. He had nothing to prove to anyone but himself. It was a week after the dinner at Leopook that Ethan decided to visit the restaurant again. He wasn't sure what he expected, but something inside him told him that he needed to face the place that had been the backdrop to his heartache. The soft light from the chandeliers glowed warmly, and the scent of roasted meats and fresh herbs filled the air, as it had the night he had confronted Rachel. But this time, the ambiance felt different. The restaurant didn't feel like a place of confrontation. It felt like a place of closure. George greeted him as he entered, a warm smile on his face. Ethan felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. There was no judgment in his father's eyes, no disappointment, only pride and acceptance. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the past few days. "I'm good. I need to talk." George nodded and led him to a quiet corner of the restaurant. He didn't rush Ethan, didn't press for details. Instead, he waited patiently, giving his son the space he needed to find his words. "She didn't understand," Ethan said after a long pause. I thought we could have a life together, but it wasn't real. I wasn't real to her, not the way she wanted. She wanted me to be someone I wasn't, someone I could never be." George listened intently, his eyes calm, a knowing expression on his face. "Son, you didn't do anything wrong. You loved her. You gave her your best, your truth. But sometimes love isn't enough when the other person isn't willing to see what's right in front of them." Ethan nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. There was a quiet relief in his chest, like he was finally letting go of something that had been holding him down. "I thought she would see it. I thought if I were more like her, that would change, fix it, and make it right." Ethan hesitated before saying. George placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. "She couldn't. But that doesn't change who you are, Ethan. You're a good man. Don't let anyone, especially her, make you feel like you're anything less." Ethan looked up at his father, his chest swelling with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. For the first time in weeks, he felt the tightness in his heart loosen. He was ready to move on, to let go of the past and walk into a future where his worth was defined by his own standards, not by someone else's. He didn't need Rachel's approval. He didn't need anyone's validation but his own. Meanwhile, Rachel sat alone in her apartment, the silence around her deafening. She had made so many attempts to call Ethan, to apologize, to explain herself. But each time, her calls went unanswered, each voicemail left unheard. It had taken her days to come to terms with the fact that he wasn't coming back. The dreams she had once woven around him had unraveled, and in their place was only a deep, aching void. She sat at her kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the flowers Ethan had once given her. The bouquet, now wilted and lifeless, was a sad reflection of her own heart. "You were right," she thought, staring at the crumpled petals. "I was wrong." Don't forget to like if you find this story meaningful to you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. In the days that followed, Rachel spent more time in reflection than she ever had in her life. She had always believed that wealth would give her everything she wanted: status, love, security. But now she saw how hollow that belief had been. She had chased the wrong things, and in the process, she had lost everything that truly mattered. Ethan had moved on. He had found his peace, his strength, and Rachel was left in the wreckage of her own misguided pursuit, her heart empty, her soul searching for something that could never be reclaimed. And as she sat alone, surrounded by the reminders of the life she thought she wanted, Rachel finally understood. She had lost Ethan, yes, but she had also lost herself in the process. The cruel irony of it all was that in her search for material wealth, she had forgotten the one thing that had been right in front of her the whole time. A love in its purest, most genuine form had always been about seeing the other person for who they truly were. And that was a truth she could never undo.